Hi friends, welcome to today's video. I want to take some time talking about a very important development that's happened in the education system here in New Zealand. And if you're a parent, if you have children in schools in New Zealand, or if you're just a concerned citizen wondering what sort of education your tax dollars are funding, then this video is extremely important. It's extremely important that you be made aware of Unteach Racism. The Teaching Council has recently released a new resource called Unteach Racism. This resource includes a website, an app, and countless articles and academic papers. And I'm convinced that this resource is steeped in critical theory and that Unteach Racism actually does the exact opposite of what it purports to do. Unteach Racism teaches us that we should in fact discriminate against people based on their race and ethnicity. So that's why I say if you're a parent with children in our public schools, or even if you're simply concerned about the direction of education in New Zealand, then you need to be aware of what's going on with this resource. Not only have the Teaching Council released this resource and this app, but they've also tied the ideas in here directly to the code and standards, which teachers must sign each year pledging to uphold. I want to spend some time here looking at the foundations of Unteach Racism and showing you the flawed and irrational thinking behind this resource. Now, Unteach Racism is riddled with critical theory assumptions and ideas. And in order to make heads or tails out of what you're reading, it's necessary to unpack a few of these ideas inherent in this resource. I want to show you a couple ways in which the Unteach Racism resource directly reflects the core tenets of critical theory. Firstly, we should ask, what is racism? Helpfully, the Unteach Racism website provide us with a helpful resource, a glossary with definitions. They say this: racism is a system that creates and sustains racial inequities through a collection of racist ideas, actions, or policies. Now, as soon as I read this definition, it immediately rung a bell with me because it sounded very similar to the definition of racism promoted by a guy named Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Antiracist. This book was a seminal book for critical theorists, and it was a New York Times #1 bestseller. Very, very popular book. I've read the literature, I've read the book, and this is what he says. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial iniquities. Now, maybe these definitions are a little too different to draw a direct connection, and I wouldn't have emphasized the fact that I think there's a connection here. However, in the bibliography for these definitions, they directly reference Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And keep this in mind, Ibram X. Kendi has written prolifically as a critical theorist. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he even says this: the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Now, the massive problem with the definition provided by Unteach Racism is that it completely redefines racism. Racism is no longer an attitude of ethnic hatred or ethnic superiority. It isn't showing partiality based on race. No. Now, racism is anything that produces or sustains iniquity. And here we run head on into the first foundational assumption of the critical theorists. The assumption is this: all disparities are evidence of oppression. This is why the Education Review Office can say things like this: the #1 challenge facing the New Zealand education system is to achieve equity and excellence in student outcomes. And this is why the Unteach Racism document can say this: Māori achievement levels are significantly different to those of non-Māori. The addressing of this disparity is of utmost importance. Now, why is addressing this disparity of utmost importance? Well, It is because by the very definitions provided to us by the Teaching Council, this disparity is the smoking gun that proves the education system is racist. Or in the words of Ibram Kendi, when I see racial disparities, I see racism. This is the first assumption. This first assumption is also where the massive naivety of the Teaching Council begins to show. You see, the equation disparity equals oppression is not a formula that is examined empirically. Rather, it is a starting assumption that they then try to justify through the use of other tenets of critical theory. To see just how deeply rooted this assumption is, we can look at Module 1 of the Unteach Racism Act, where they attempt to prove to us the systemic racism of New Zealand institutions. The section of the module on systemic racism begins like this: identifying systemic racism in Aotearoa New Zealand. In what ways has racism shaped our systems, structures, and social outcomes? What are the outcomes of racist systems and policies? And then we get an activity where we explore the evidence for systemic racism. So keep in mind, what we're about to receive is evidence for systemic racism in New Zealand. And spoiler alert, all we get is examples of the existence of disparities. Here's the first activity. As at June 2017, the unemployment rate for Pākehā was 3.4%. For Māori, it was, and you take a guess, and lo and behold, the unemployment rate for Māori was 11.1%. So Māori had an 11% unemployment rate when Pākehā had a 3.4% unemployment rate, therefore systemic racism. No discussion of other factors that might contribute to this disparity. No demonstration that the primary cause for the disparity is a discriminatory system. No. Rather, the mere presentation of the disparity is taken as evidence of the systemic racism. Here's the second example. In 2017, the mean hourly rate for Pākehā was $30.09, while the mean for Pacific peoples was $22.96. Again, no evidence that this is caused by discrimination, but instead, it is merely assumed that this proves that systemic racism is at work. Now, any decent economist could tell you that there are dozens of reasons why a wage gap might exist between Pākehā and Pacific Islanders. Just one example of external factors that play a role in this kind of wage gap is the median age for Pacific Islanders versus the median age for Pākehā. So, in New Zealand, the median age for Samoans in New Zealand is 22.8 years old, while the median age for Europeans in New Zealand is 41. Should we expect these groups to be equally represented in professions that require years of experience and therefore pay higher? No. The answer is obviously no. This is simply to say that merely presenting a disparity, a difference in wage averages, does nothing to demonstrate discrimination. One more example here. The next one we get is this. 52.9% of New Zealand's prison population is Māori. And then the next slide, 18.7% of the total population is Māori. So Māori make up 18.7% of the population, but they make up 52.9% of the prison population. Now, I think this example is particularly nefarious. You see, the implication is because Māori are overrepresented in prison, therefore the justice system is systemically racist. Are there no other factors that can explain this disparity? Is this evidence that the justice system is racist? How about we consider some other questions? How about these questions in terms of other factors that might contribute to this disparity that don't include racism or systemic racism? How about these questions to consider? Do Māori commit a disproportionately large amount of crime? Are Māori more likely to be members of gangs? Is there a relationship between gang membership and criminality? Are Māori more likely to come from broken families? Is there a relationship between broken families and criminality? Are Māori more likely to be unemployed? Is there a relationship between unemployment and criminality? Are Māori more likely to be addicted to drugs or alcohol? Are they more likely to lack in education? Is it possible that any of these factors might be a significant contributor to the disparity in prisons? Or is it all just systemic racism? The Teaching Council have their answer. And what they want is for teachers to adopt the same answer. In fact, according to them, it is a necessary requirement for teachers now. They say this: teachers' commitment to tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partnership means, for example, taking active steps to achieve equitable outcomes for Māori learners. Taking active steps to achieve equitable outcomes for Māori learners. To translate that for you, what that means is discriminate against white kids in your class and show favoritism and partiality to the brown kids. The thing that the Teaching Council simply refuses to recognize is that different people have different priorities and make different decisions that produce different outcomes. But apparently, in order to keep in accordance with the code, teachers must pursue equal outcomes, and we must unteach equal treatment. That's what this module was about. Unteaching equal treatment as equality. We shouldn't treat people equally. But like I said, the thing that the Teaching Council fails to recognize is that people have different priorities. They make different decisions, and those different decisions produce different outcomes. Even in a world with absolutely no prejudice or discrimination, there would still be unequal outcomes for reasons that are as boring as age demographics or geography or personal preferences. But look at how arrogantly the Teaching Council dismiss any other possible explanation for disparity. They say this: in the past, Māori educational achievement was seen as a multifaceted issue, where reasons for disparities were difficult, not only to define, but also to question. More recently, causes and consequences are much more regularly agreed upon. The shattering effect of Pākehā colonization on Māori culture certainly cannot be contested. Now here we see the ideas on full display. Don't demonstrate through evidence that the disparity is a result of racism. Simply assume it at the outset, and then seek to justify that assumption by appealing to other tenets of critical theory. The one mentioned there was colonization, or what's technically known as historic trauma. Now, just on this point of arrogant dismissal, take as an example the curious case of Dr. Thomas Sowell. An African-American man, he grew up on the mean streets of Harlem and has gone on to graduate from Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Chicago. Then he went on to teach at Cornell, UCLA, Rutgers, Amherst, and now Stanford, where he serves as senior fellow for the Hoover Institute. He is a world-renowned economist who has published over 50 books and a mountain of scholarly articles. He has done more research on justice, disparities, and racism than most people ever to live. And he fundamentally disagrees with the core tenets of critical theory. In his book, Discrimination and Disparities, he does tear this argument to shreds. Be that as it may, I have yet to find a critical theorist who even cites Thomas Sowell, let alone engages seriously with his arguments. And I read the literature regularly. I've read dozens and dozens of these articles and a significant number of books. They do not engage with Thomas Sowell. Not one yet has even cited him. But with a few sentences, his entire body of work is dismissed because causes and consequences are much more regularly agreed upon, according to Unteached Racism. That is pathetic. Now, without going off into a tangent about the poor argumentation required to sustain the historic trauma argument, this mention of colonization does bring us to a second major critical theory idea embedded in the Unteached Racism resource, namely hegemony. Now, before we explore how this idea is wedded to the Unteached Racism resource, we should first seek to understand what is meant by this term, hegemony. So this is the definition provided to us by the Unteached Racism app, and it says this: hegemony is a social mechanism where those in power attempt to normalize their dominant worldview. It is the power and control of the dominant group over others in a diverse society, and it is generally unnoticeable to those it serves. Cultural hegemony is the normalizing in society of the culture and values of the dominant group. Now, again, in giving this definition, the Teaching Council draws from prominent critical theorists. This time, it seems they are drawing the definition from another core text for critical theorists, the book called Is Everyone Really Equal by Robin DiAngelo, who is also the author of White Fragility and co-author Özlem Sensoy. They reference this book in the bibliography as well for the definitions. Now, I know the literature well enough to see where all of this is coming from. Essentially, the idea of hegemony is that powerful groups normalize their own ways of knowing, their own values, their own culture through dominant discourses, and thereby oppress all others who do not fit their cultural mold. Now, for what it's worth, that idea in and of itself isn't terrible. However, critical theorists have taken it far beyond any reasonable restraints and have labeled nearly all things part of the hegemonic systems of oppression. The key place we see this is in the area of knowledge or epistemology, how we know what we know. Critical theory not only rejects the idea of objective knowledge, but it goes further and suggests that objectivity is not even desirable. In fact, seeking to have objective knowledge is a form of oppression or racism. In the same book I just mentioned, the authors say this: one of the key contributions of critical theorists concerns the production of knowledge. Given that the transmission of knowledge is an integral activity in schools, critical scholars in the field of education have been especially concerned with how knowledge is produced. These scholars argue that a key element of social injustice involves the claim that particular knowledge is objective, neutral, and universal. An approach based on critical theory calls into question the idea that objectivity is desirable or even possible. The term used to describe this way of thinking about knowledge is that knowledge is socially constructed. When we refer to knowledge as socially constructed, we mean that knowledge is reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it. This term captures the understanding that all content and all means of knowing are connected to a social context. Now, notice that for critical theorists, the claim to have objective knowledge is a form of injustice. The idea that our ways of knowing are merely social constructions that have been erected to perpetuate the domination of powerful groups. If we construct our education system in a way that promotes certain types of knowledge as being objectively true, types of knowledge like math or science or, God forbid, Bible studies, then this will invariably produce unequal outcomes among students. And remember, disparity equals injustice. The phrase used again and again by the Unteach Racism app when it's talking about this hegemonic system of oppression. The phrase they use again and again is a Western frame of reference. This is the idea that when we evaluate Māori students by empirical standards and statistical analysis, this is an act of subjugating Māori to a Western frame of reference, quote unquote. So here's the crazy thing. Even if we buy into the idea that the disparity is inherently bad and we decide that we need to mitigate these disparities, now we need to do so without measuring the outcomes by a racist Western hegemonic standard. Let's have a closer look now at the foundation document for the Unteach Racism app and see these ideas laid out more clearly. So we've got a string of quotes from the foundational literature scan document. I want to read those and then engage with them. So here they are. While understanding the impact of colonization helps to put today's situation into historical context, it has done little else. Any attempt to redress our damaging history has had little impact on Māori achievement levels. Many prominent researchers, such as Bishop, Berriman, Milne, Pinatito, Chu, Thaman, and Smith, all assert that this is because these attempts have remained within a Western or colonizing frame of reference. Much of the research and professional development initiatives that have been developed as a response to Māori achievement have been within a Western frame of reference. Indigenous education outcomes are inevitably compared with and measured against national and international norms. Benchmarking tests and surveys embedded in Western hegemonic values and ideals. One more. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we focus on measurable, known, and quantifiable outcomes, such as NCEA results, literacy and numeracy, data, and levels of engagement in education. These statistics, in and of themselves, still reflect the educational well-being of young Māori as understood and defined by Pākehā. Notice a few things in these quotes. Firstly, if you are attempting to redress disparities by empowering Māori to achieve success in math or science by helping them with their homework or going out of your way to do after-school tutorials, if you're trying to empower them to achieve by objective, measurable, quantifiable standards, you need to recognize that, according to Unteach Racism, you're participating in hegemonic oppression. You're attempting to redress harm from within your Western frame of reference. Your efforts to teach and support are racist. If you tell parents that their child would benefit from having a quiet place to study and do their homework, then you are being racist. You're imposing your Western norms on the Indigenous and requiring them to make a cultural leap. This is why they are underachieving. Now that almost sounds like a joke. If you're encouraging parents to give their kids a quiet place to study, is that racist? Is that why they're underachieving? Here's a quote from the literature scan. Initiatives such as family literacy programs, which teach parents how to better support their children's reading, and initiatives which encourage quiet spaces for homework and reading, imply to parents that whānau and the natural, noisy, busy environment of a large extended family is not conducive to learning, and to parents that they lack the skills to support their children's learning. So what is the solution then? What are we to do? Well, in order to redress the harm and disparities, we need to embrace, quote unquote, Indigenous knowledges. You see, in the critical theory worldview, there isn't objective knowledge. Instead, there are ways of knowing. What we call knowledge is simply the way of knowing that our society, our racist society, has legitimized. Western ways of knowing like reason, logic, soundness of argument, validity, these are no more valuable than Indigenous ways of knowing, according to critical theory. What are some Indigenous ways of knowing? Māori spiritual knowledge or lived experience. Therefore, what is needed is the deconstruction of the entire system to make room for other ways of knowing. Here's what Unteached Racism says. An influential body of revisionist research is asserting that Indigenous values and knowledges are essential to redressing the impact of colonialism in our education system, and that the continued exclusion of these amounts to racism. Get that? Unless you treat Indigenous knowledges, quote unquote, as valid and essential, you are guilty of racism. If you believe that there is truth and falsehood, and truth isn't Western or Indigenous, rather truth is that which comports with the nature of reality as defined by God himself. If you believe that, then you are racist according to the Teaching Council. Now, this ideology is absolutely radical. It seeks to fundamentally transform all of society and revolutionize every single institution. If you haven't picked this up yet, critical theory is steeped in neo-Marxist ideology. These thinkers are radical leftist propagandists who literally view their overturning of Western society as an act of revolutionary liberation for the oppressed. Destroying quote-unquote Western knowledge for these people is an act of resistance, a freedom struggle, a fight for justice. Just look at this quote. Day, as quoted in Milne, aligns the retention of Indigenous knowledge with resistance. Today, Indigenous knowledge is about the struggle to retain one's identity in the call for a global sameness. Indigenous knowledge is about resistance, not in the romanticized sense, but resistance as struggle to navigate the tensions of today's modernized, globalized world while seeking to disrupt its universalizing hegemonic norms. Now, off the back of all of this, my question is, how on earth can the Teaching Council force this on teachers and on schools? This resource is clearly going to function as the tool by which all white people will be slandered as racist. White privilege is all throughout this document. It will be used to fundamentally transform any reasonable attempts to help Māori, and it will plummet them into the ideology of victimhood that will strip from them all mana and agency and leave them worse off than they were before. As far as I'm concerned, the New Zealand Teaching Council are the racists. They're the race hustlers and they're the discriminators. They do not represent the black or brown voice. In fact, the ideology of critical theory is one of the whitest, most elitist ideologies in the world. This stuff is more popular among white liberal academics than anywhere else in the world. And I would strongly suggest to anyone with kids in public schools, contact your school immediately and insist that they do not make use of this resource and that they complain to the Teaching Council. This is not okay to be promoted in schools, yet it is. And this is just scratching the surface of Unteached Racism. There's more to come, and there's more to know about this ridiculous racist document. I'll see you in a future video.